Nathaniel Johnston was in a bind. Now, this wasn't a run-of-the-mill, inconsequential predicament by any stretch of the imagination, and by all means it wasn't of the everyday sort. Mind you, lest we run afoul spoiling any suspense or surprise by unwitting divulgence, it was the sort of difficulty that men of Nathaniel's caliber don't normally come back from. Nonetheless, Nate, as his friends referred to him, prayed earnestly for swift assistance from the hands of the Almighty or some governing angel that might happen upon the sight of his current predicament. But we're getting quite ahead of the origination of our woeful tale. So let us first turn back the incessant march of time and the cruel hand of fate and put first things first. It all started just over 2 years earlier, and by Nathaniel's recollection, there was indeed a precise moment from which he could clearly mark his present situation as thoroughly unavoidable from the viewpoint of providence and predestination. That is, Nathaniel expected the exact moment that sealed his fate was the instant he scrawled his compressed signature into the confines of a blank rectangle at the top of a long line of other blank rectangles in the tome-like manifest of the Gloria Dei, a 62-foot whaler out of Sag Harbor. Her name was a dedication, or perhaps an attempt at an invocation, whose point was to ensure success and meant glory to God in Latin. But there seemed little glory in this now. There were, of course, other trades young Nathaniel could have endeavored in or apprenticed himself to, but if whaling was good enough for his father, then all sound reason and his status as a Protestant in good standing suggested it was good enough for him too. Besides, whaling was good business. Surely there were more pleasant, or at least less hazardous, forms of employment available. For goodness sake, he could have taken a post on a fishing sloop, or even worked in the market shucking clams and oysters. There was farming, too, or he could have emigrated to the city. He had heard that there were all sorts of new situations available in factories, workhouses, and the like, and opportunities had really become much more plentiful since the decade of his birth, which occurred shortly after the conclusion of the Second War between the United States and Great Britain. But for Nathaniel to have done any of those things, he would have been forced to turn his back on the sea. And that was just not in Nathaniel Johnston's nature. Nathaniel and his numerous siblings all sprouted up in a humble, yellow-hued colonial home not 50 yards from the pier. It was just far enough a distance to dissipate the pungent scent of the daily catch from the market, but not enough to eliminate the almost intoxicating odor of the bubbly foam and spray of the waves as they crashed against the rocky shoreline. He and his younger brothers, when not tending to their otherwise pedestrian schooling and endless chores, would loiter about the harbor in awe of the ships that would appear, seemingly by magic, overnight. Once even a grand government frigate sat perched just off the coast, and boats carrying decorated sailors on leave boarded to their utter glee and amazement. And then there was Sally Hutchinson. She had caught Nathaniel's eye as far back as the 3rd grade, and he earnestly hoped that she shared his feelings likewise. He remembered now, in this most uncomfortable instant, the evening after the 4th of July church picnic when the pair snuck off and shared a single illicit kiss, hidden behind the old oak tree. He recalled now how their quivering lips gently pushed together for hardly more than a moment, no matter that it was the first and the last time such a bold dalliance passed under the noses of their parents. Regardless, Nathaniel knew that his heart would forever be tethered to Sally's from that moment on. Still, we were quite youthful at the time, Nathaniel reasoned as he spoke aloud, his voice almost drowned out by the repeated sloshing and clapping of the ocean upon the shrinking boundary of his Isle of Hope. Once, when he was about to embark on one of his minor voyages, that of the famous gold salvage mission to be performed on the sunken steamship the Lexington, where 143 had gone to the bosom of their creator in the wintry frost of the Long Island Sound. He recalled that young Sally could not see it fit to bid him a fare thee well at the pier. He suspected that she had been encouraged by her family to pass him over in preference to other suitors more to her father's liking, and of course, those who were more monetarily suitable matches for a girl of her family's standing. All the more cause to keep my compass firmly set for the seas, he consoled himself as he once again adjusted his footing along the slippery crest that poked from those same unforgiving, salty seas. But that was long ago, and Nathaniel had made a go of it as a whaler for these last few years, and an earnest go it was. From green hand, to blubber-cutting crewman, to able harpooner, to experienced mate, his tenure aboard the Gloria Dei was to be, if he was counting correctly, his 9th voyage into the deeper waters of the frigid Atlantic. As a ship, the Dei was indeed a sight to be seen, a 3-mast bark rig that was set to sail for a minimum of 6 months at a stretch, and passed the Azores and islands in early spring, only to circle around just off the coasts of Africa and Brazil for the voyage home in late summer. This was no cutter, brig, or schooner. It was a tall ship with proud sails unfurled against the wind, and Nathaniel's cut of the haul, or lay as it was called, could fetch as much as 1/32% of the total boom. Not a bad piece of work at all, particularly in light of the fact that his last voyage had him finally out of debt. There would be no need to purchase more than his worth from the ship's store this time, as Nathaniel had new boots and clothes gifted from his family, and he did not engage in any of the vile, heathen-like habits such as smoking tobacco or drinking alcohol. Indeed, he would eat meals with the captain, and the prospect was that these would be meals fit for a human being, and not the sort he had when he was a green hand. Thankfully gone were the days of sleeping in a cramped bunk, perched along a corridor wall, and sitting uncomfortably on the edge of his sea chest, gnashing his teeth on hard biscuits and drinking coffee sweetened only with the bitterest of molasses. Still, life aboard the Gloria Dei was no 4th of July picnic by any qualification. This was a whaler, and after all, whaling was the business of the ship. Whales had to be first located amid the vast unknown, and then hunted and slaughtered by harpoon. From this description, one might think that was the worst of it, but nay, that was just the start. For in what the crew of the Dei designed to do for profit, they needed the great beast to be dismembered into innumerable pieces as it bobbed and rolled in the increasingly blood-tinted water hooked to the keel. All the while, every carnivorous creature that desired to take a morsel of sustenance from what remained of that immense carcass would be up from the depths and down from the skies and be upon the men if they didn't work fast. The crewmen, poised in their whaleboats, cut away the head and blubber with long and short spades, strip by strip, in bloody slices, and tossed them upon the deck by the service of long forks, so the chopping and mincing could break the foul matter down and get it quickly into the pots. And that was what it was all about, mostly. Bringing home whale oil. Nathaniel had almost come to relish the overwhelming smell of that unduly pungent fat being rendered and skimmed in those oversized percolating cauldrons. Regardless of the inhuman stench, he had come to associate that very dreadful scent with home, or at least his home on the sea. After the fat had all been had and methodically placed in barrels stored in the hold, the whale's carcass was dragged aboard out of the mouths of the other, less deadly predators of the sea, and was scraped clean down to the bone. The skin was laid in sheets, and wax called spermaceti was removed from the creature's head. In the end, the parts of the skeleton were bundled together in faggots piled upon the deck. This hard tissue, and sometimes teeth, would be boiled into soap, polished into ladies' corset pins and made into scrimshaw, art carved from the sturdy material. Nathaniel's father had, over the years, become quite adept at carving scrimshaw, much of which adorned the mantel over the drawing room fireplace. It was a skill that Nathaniel felt he had inherited from his progenitor in some fashion, passed on, as it were, if not through breeding, then by shared vocation. In his waistcoat pocket, even now, he held tight to a small memento he had carved some time ago for Sally. It was a brooch with, if he did say so himself, a fairly accurate illustration of the qualities of a whale set nearby a whaling ship, or, more specifically, his whaling ship, right at its center. Perhaps when he might happen upon her again, he thought to gift it to her, as to facilitate her thoughts to dwell on him as his did on her. Nevertheless, he grasped the small piece of smooth bone tightly in his palm inside of the large pocket, and breathed a sigh of relief that it was indeed still accounted for, and had not been lost to the depths in all of the tumult that preceded the impetus of his current dreadful state. In light of it all, Nathaniel reckoned that it was indeed quite a fortunate happenstance that two good-sized baleen right whales had been caught this very day, all but simultaneously, with all measure due to the vim and wherewithal of the crew of the Gloria Dei. The larger of the two, a female, if only judging from the distraught behavior of a now confused calf who attempted to interfere with the crew's good work, had been dragged back to the ship and bailed to Hull so the rendering could begin. But that's when it all started to go wrong. To this day, and we can expect that for all eternity, no soul, not even Nathaniel Johnston, will ever know the true reason and cause for the impetus of the Gloria Dei's calamity. But be that as it may, the calamity did indeed come. It seems that a rather impressive conflagration had taken root somewhere in the stern of the ship. Dunnage and cargo had lit aflame, and the blaze had grown unattended while a large portion of the men were off-ship hunting the whales. By the time the fire was noted by the captain, it was already far too late. Black smoke poured from the hold, and the crewmen out on the whaleboats did their best to scurry back aboard to assist in quelling the mounting blaze. For any who were below decks, we need not pity them their quick demise, for as the flames lighted the mizzenmast, scaling it from stay to topgallant, moving swiftly up the rigging like a spider scaling a web, it was clear to all that this torrent stood little chance of being reversed. Of course, there was ample water to be taken from the sea, and thusly Nathaniel, along with the rest of the crew, black and white, Presbyterian and Catholic, and even the ship's singular Portuguese Jew from Nantucket, all bravely helped fight the flames. In a circular line, the concerned men moved buckets of ocean brine across the deck, each handing a vessel to the man to his fore. But little could be done as the wind suddenly shifted direction, and the fire all but seemed to jump across the empty sky and likewise lit the main mast ablaze. Some of the men sought to flee to make their way back to the two whaleboats still bobbing in the drink, but this hope was squashed when the mizzenmast fell, raining death on the 29 souls who served upon the Gloria Dei. As the mizzen forced the main mast to fall to starboard, so went the foremast, like flaming dominoes, rolling the ship toward the side, tethered to the eyeless mother whale. Beams all a-tinder fell from the Dei, raining down upon the aimless whaleboats, and they too were crushed under a weight and set upon by flame. In all, 28 of the crew of the Gloria Dei were lost at sea that frightful day, either burnt or drowned, or given up to the sea and the creatures therein, that 15th day of June, the year of our Lord, 1845. All of them, except, that is, for Nathaniel Johnston. Whether through divine intervention, random happenstance, or simple fortune, Nathaniel found himself spared from any of those horrible fates and left among the living. At present, all he could remember was losing clear sight of the captain in the haze of black soot and smoke as the whale oil, too, ignited. After that, he could not for his life recall how he made his way to this outcrop of hope. Perhaps he had merely slid from the deck to this waiting chariot, but in this he had no sound explanation. And so here he was. Sunk now was the Gloria Dei, his only means of transport home, and the only means of sure survival upon the open sea. Perhaps one might ponder what sort of raft or flotsam poor Nathaniel did cling to with eager perseverance in order to ensure his continued existence. For you see, this slippery crest, this isle of hope, this raft of survival, was none other than the upturned belly of the lifeless, one-eyed mother whale. The exact length of time Nathaniel slumbered prone on the belly of the beast only the angels might say with sure confidence. But he could be certain that the light of day had long since started to wane. Girding his fortitude, he rose and attempted to stand upon the carcass-cum island, reeling almost to a swoon, his neck and head aching sorely. To a touch of his brow, Nathaniel's blood-painted fingertips were as red as the whale's vital fluid that tinted the water beneath and around them both. Whale lice, a type of shrimp-like crustacean, with not much in common with the landed insect pest, scurried in numbers as best they could away from his oncoming tentative footfalls. But these creatures were not here to feast on the carcass directly, for her thick hide was so recently their home. No longer would they hitch a ride, tethered by their pincers to this dead flesh, and like Nathaniel, their prospects did not appear particularly promising. Nary minding the late hour, gulls still noisily feasted somewhat far from the corpse, waiting atop the sloshing crest, plucking morsels of torn viscera left over from the damage done by creatures with larger appetites and abilities. Almost mesmerized by the frenzy, Nathaniel slowly moved along the mother whale's wide girth to the edge that sunk into the water. To be honest, the creature must not have been positioned fully upside down, as the right-handed flipper was raised out of the sea on a 30-some-odd degree angle, reflecting a tilt to the orientation of the carcass. At the moment, Nathaniel didn't realize how fortuitous this off-kilter fin had been in saving him once before, and soon enough it would save his life yet again. For just as he reached the bound of where he felt confident he could tread without sliding into the sea, the arc of the beast suddenly shifted. This was not from a wave or some other natural condition, but from an abrupt, brutal tug generated by the powerful jaws of what appeared to be a female great white shark. She had surfaced in a roll, as her species often did, in order to more easily rip a mouthful of whale meat from the increasingly defaced remains. Nathaniel's foot slipped, and one of his legs went out from the other. Had he not held tight to that stiff fin, hugging it with all his might as if it were the Sally of his imagination, he might have fallen into the sea and been beset upon by the eye-rolling shark or any number of sharks who he imagined would have cared little for any distinction between the dead whale and he. But thankfully, the jarring soon stopped, and the whale assumed its previous slant, so Nathaniel quickly scurried back to his relatively safe position. Having become an expert on the taxonomy of the whale, he knew that one of these savage shark bites, or perhaps even a slight peck from one of the tittering birds, would eventually puncture the mother whale's bladder, and she would sink fast into the fathomless depths, taking him along for his own voyage downward to eternity. It was only a matter of time. Who knew how long it would take for the whale to sink? It would all depend on the hunger of the feeding creatures about it. But even if it didn't happen swiftly, he reasoned that he wouldn't be able to survive more than a few days without fresh water. Nathaniel, for the most part, chose not to dwell on the melodramatic in life, but his situation looked grim, and his end seemed, well, inevitable. For a while he moved about the belly, pacing back and forth. But after a spell, he tired and sat, holding his knees to his chest in an attempt to warm his form from the increasing cool the disappearance of the sun had brought. "Oh, Sally, if you could only see me now," Nathaniel bemoaned aloud in a small, pitiable mutter. The hours of uncertainty which followed felt somehow painstakingly slow, and surely such was more than enough to drive any sane man mad. Nonetheless, our young whaler sat huddled and shivering on that almost gracefully buoyant island, waiting. As a method of soothing his fretful soul, his introspection drove his thoughts further inward, and he became lost in imaginations of being somewhere, anywhere other than where he was. But every time he started to convince himself of the reality of one of those fantasies, or merely when he started to succumb to fatigue, a fresh bite from one of the ravenous sharks served to jar him back to the sad, unique reality that was his alone to suffer. And so passed the first night. As dawn came, the sun broke the horizon and shined in an unforgiving fashion into Nathaniel's eyes, forcing him back to our temporal sphere and alerting him to the fact that little had changed since he first found himself in this odd predicament. It had clearly been at least 9 hours, yet every minute felt as if it were 10 times that, if not more. Over the course of the morning, as the great star's arc crested in its usual fashion, that life-giving ball of fire served only to oppress Nathaniel's already broken spirit, beating down on him mercilessly. His once shivering frame was soon overheated, and he reasoned that he was the proverbial rock in a hard place. If he stayed as he was, he would soon suffer what his fellow sailors called heat stroke. And if he removed the waistcoat that had kept him warm through all his voyages, his fair flesh would be quickly burnt, aiding only his mounting thirst and imminent dehydration. Though he was quite parched, he knew better than to sop up any seawater that sprayed nearby his position, for to drink such, though it might sate his thirst momentarily, would make for courting suicide, and Nathaniel reasoned that no matter what, in the end we must all persevere and maintain hope with some manner of dignity. But then again, in some situations, might there not be extenuating circumstances? Best not dwell on it, he thought to himself aloud, and he went back to the laborious task of shielding his face under a canopy supplied by his waistcoat held aloft. By mid-afternoon, he tired and holding his arms up, and the weight of his coat bore as heavily upon him as did Moses' staff at the Red Sea, but without the aid of his fellow Israelites, and he fast succumbed to overwhelming exhaustion. His vision blurred, and his hearing became muffled as if a million flies had suddenly dug into his eardrum, and soon he lost his senses and lay prone under the beating glare of the sun. He woke repeatedly throughout the day, shaken to consciousness by the work of the sharks, or startled by the noxious smell of the rotting belly of his dead host. Nathaniel's cheek was pressed down upon the remarkably cool skin of the whale's belly, which gave him some slight respite from the brutal omnipresence of the day star. By the time dusk approached once again, clouds were set on the horizon like a great painted canvas, and his skin was so severely blistered from the heat that it smarted to even his gentlest touch. All too soon, the heat that he dreaded through the dragging hours was replaced by an equivalent dismay regarding the increasing chill of night. Periods of still silence seemed to linger, and led him to imagine himself floating in a fishing hole back home, rather than upon the open sea. But every time his guard relaxed, the interloping of a new addition to the corps of circling predators of the deep jarred him repeatedly back to his sad reality. Sleep came not to Nathaniel Johnston through that second torturous eve, but in what seemed a parcel of divine intervention, the heavens showed their pity upon him the next morning, as a cloudy sky impeded some measure of the sun's power from baking him once again. The sky grew darker and darker, and the movement of the water rocked the whale as it became more agitated. Soon a strong wind gusted hard into his face and sprayed stinging brine into his lesion-pocked visage. In the distance, thunder crashed and lightning flashed, and the mounting sound of a high-pitched pattering denoted that this storm brought with it a fearsome quantity of rain. Still, there was no assurance that the torrent might move to encompass his position and rain down the life-sustaining fresh water he needed to survive to see another day. With fear etched deep into the concerned flesh of his brow, Nathaniel earnestly prayed, invoking certain salvation from the skies. Perhaps his devotion was rewarded by the Almighty, or perhaps it was just a trick of the fates, pushing the clouds above the whale and he, but rain did indeed fall upon both. Nathaniel looked to the sky with his eyes tightly shut and opened his lips wide as he attempted to capture as much water as he could within the bounds of his mouth. Gulping one mouthful down after the other, his thirst only seemed to grow with the amount he could ingest. And if it does not serve to illustrate any undue indignity upon our young hero, at least no more than Job did endure, much of the liquid came back up his gullet, accompanied by bile and a fit of sudden nausea. Still he drank more, regardless of his condition, as he knew that this pure liquid might be his only forthcoming sustenance. But as quickly as the storm approached, it passed, and soon the stark fierceness of the sun returned, and returned it did with a vengeance. Nathaniel was so heated that he felt as if he were truly on fire. He curled into a ball with his knees to his chest and his waistcoat draped over his upper half. Perspiration dripped from his skin like a spigot, and he closed his eyes, feeling the shaking of the whale's submerged half reverberating through his body as the carnivores below continued their gluttonous frenzy. By the late afternoon it had cooled somewhat, and Nathaniel ripped a button off his once handsome waistcoat and used it to begin engraving his final farewells on the back of the Scrimshaw he intended to give to Sally. He repeatedly scratched a stream of tiny letters into a lengthy scrawl into the now fully adorned object bore the tearful words, "Dear Mother and Father, I have come to naught in a most useless manner. Know that I have always held great affection for you and my siblings. Please inform Miss Hutchinson of the sad fate that has befallen me. Yours with great devotion, Nathaniel." Once the young carver finished his long hours of message writing, he held the piece aloft and admired the handiwork of his labor. The setting sun glinted on the polished surface, and at once Nathaniel felt complete. He stood upon the whale and yelled at the heavens, invoking God himself to scoop his soul out of his body and deliver him into the bosom of his fathers. But this did not come to pass. And so he resigned himself and sat and waited and waited and waited. His waiting became fatigue again, and shortly as before he lulled into a slumber, the Scrimshaw still held in his hand. Suddenly he was jostled awake by the same large female shark returning for yet another meal. He sat up and grabbed into the thick hide beneath his posterior, hoping to brace himself for the tumult to come. Perhaps Nathaniel should have returned the memento to his waistcoat pocket earlier, but one of the jolts was so severe that he indeed lost his hold upon the piece of bone, and it rolled down the arc of the whale's belly like a child's marble. He dived to retrieve it before it was swallowed by the drink, but as he lay upon his belly, he came almost face to face with the maw of the savage shark. He, of course, recoiled, and with his outstretched hand still grasping only at air, he watched with a dismayed heart as his precious piece of Scrimshaw sunk quickly out of sight into the fathomless depths of the frigid Atlantic. Nathaniel sobbed aloud, with not one of his manly peers there to gaze with judgment against him, and as he watched the sinking piece of bone quickly fade from sight, he noted that his Isle of Hope had indeed shrunk in size, by his estimation, since he last took note of its periphery. It wouldn't be long now, he reckoned. Perhaps by morning, maybe even before. As dusk approached, once again he girded himself and thought fondly of Sally, his loved ones, and of course his now lost shipmates. But then he noted some distant movement on the horizon. Admittedly, it must have been many miles and miles away and stood only as but a speck in the distance, but unless he was mistaken, there it was, another whaler out in the open ocean. Nathaniel stood and waved his arms over his head wildly and even shouted, although he knew that there was no conceivable way that any soul on that distant vessel could have heard him, but surely, perhaps with a spyglass, they could have seen him. His desperation found new vigor from who knows what reserves he had left in the core of his manhood, and he signaled the ship energetically, regardless of what little duress his bodily frame could still endure. Soon after, the ship turned hard to port, and for an instant his hopes soared as if held aloft by the angels, and he reasoned that perhaps the crew of the ship had indeed spotted the remains of the whale from afar and were now moving to claim their prize and thereby, inadvertently, become his unwitting saviors. Had they beheld him or not? With the seas now sloshing full over the belly of the mother whale, Nathaniel stood ankle-deep in the cold ocean water, but paid little mind to the cluster of blood-tinted fins located a mere stone's throw away from his position and braced his footing on the increasingly slippery skin. Perhaps the ship would arrive before the waters overtook his shrinking island. Perhaps not. Oh, how he longed to have not lost his grip on that lovely little piece of Scrimshaw. It was only a matter of time now.